So, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. It's this time of the semester where you suddenly have so many things to do. So, we're glad to have with us at today's paper presentation Professor Bogdan Popescu from John Cabot University in Rome. Before that, he taught at the University of Oxford and at Bocconi and Princeton. He received his PhD in political science from the University of Chicago. He is an author of a recent book titled Imperial Borderlands, Institutions and Legacies of the Habsburg Military Frontier. And now, in his new book, he will be moving a bit south to the Ottomans. So, Bogdan, the floor is yours. The setup is the usual, about 30-35 minutes for the presentation, and then we'll open it up to the Q&A. So, let's go.
Thank you, Eugene, for having me. Thank you for the gracious invitation. Thank you, everyone, for participating in this talk today. So, what I'm presenting today is part of my second book manuscript, but I decided to just present you a single paper. Rather than focusing on the entire second book project, I decided to just extract two chapters that I feel go very well as a single standalone papers, which is provisionally titled, When Do Imperial Legacies Fade? Bureaucratic Capacity, Social Heterogeneity, and Education at the Habsburg-Ottoman Frontier. So the big question that I'm pursuing in this research is when and why imperial legacies in education persist or erode. So I argue that negative imperial legacies persist when successor states do not build bureaucratic capacity, when there is societal heterogeneity, which raises coordination costs, essentially it's harder for society to collaborate together, and when there is societal misalignment between citizens and state, essentially when there is limited legitimacy, when populations do not find the state legitimate. So before I get into the paper itself, I'm going to start off with an empirical puzzle. So these are two political entities which no longer exist. This is the country, the Kingdom of Yugoslavia on the left-hand side, and the Kingdom of Romania as they were in 1931. What you see in this map is longevity of Ottoman rule. So these are all the counties in 1931. What you see in this area is the region that was governed by the Ottoman Empire for over 500 years. You can see here in the legend how long exactly different regions have been controlled by the Ottoman Empire for. This area was controlled by the Ottoman Empire much less. In fact, around 1600, it was taken over by the Habsburg Empire. So this thick line here represents the dividing line between the Ottoman and Habsburg Empire as it looked under the Treaty of Karlovitz in 1699. So this is another map that shows literacy in 1931. So this is a very granular census that both countries had that shows a very interesting discontinuity. You see that the southern region was much more illiterate compared to the northern regions. So you can clearly see that there is something interesting there exactly at the border between the Habsburg and the Ottoman Empire. So to be specific, the Ottoman side seems to be about 40 percentage points more illiterate compared to the Habsburg side. And if we look at the female illiteracy, the situation is even worse. So that if we look at the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, there's about 58 percentage points higher illiteracy for women in 1931. So this is interesting because this is already about 60 years after the independence from the Ottoman Empire. The interesting puzzling figure is what happens after 50 years, what happens after the end of communism. These are the same, almost the same political entities in 1991. What is interesting is that Romania almost converges to almost 100% literacy, whereas Yugoslavia doesn't. So you see here around 95% literacy rate, whereas here in the former Yugoslavia, you continue to see these differences between the former Habsburg side versus the Ottoman side. So, the question from this visual empirical examination is what explains that countries that are so similar, that had such similar past, how is it possible that one was able to overcome these differences in literacy, whereas the other did not? So Romania converged, but Yugoslavia did not. So this was the puzzle that kind of motivated the study. Now I'm going to move on to the argument and how I think my paper contributes to the literature. I'll then move on to the research design, I'll talk about mechanisms, and I'll discuss broader implications. Okay, so in terms of argument and literature, so my argument is fairly straightforward. I argue that imperial legacies impacted state capacity. This affected in turn the ability of successive states to organize centralized schooling, and this in turn affected literacy outcomes. So to be specific, the Ottoman Empire was mostly a type of state that governed peripheral regions through indirect rule. Essentially, governors were nominated to control regions in the periphery. After 1700, you had this process called tax farming, where governors were essentially buying off their positions and they would govern different regions for about 10 or even 15 years. So fundamentally, this was through privatized revenue extraction, which led to lower bureaucratic penetration in the periphery. This in turn resulted in a thin bureaucratic apparatus after the independence from the Ottoman Empire, and overall lower state capacity. The Kingdom of Yugoslavia and Romania and the communists were able to overcome these disadvantages. They tried to build nations. They focused on nation building through education. They also tried to train teachers, and as a result, you see state capacity growing. This, in turn, results into higher literacy and legacies being erased. The situation, however, is different when it comes to another type of legacy. Another important legacy that I focus on in this project is variation in ethno-religious diversity, right? So ethno-religious diversity complicates this picture. So one of the characteristics of the Ottoman Empire is the millet system. This is a term that really reflects the idea that different religious groups were allowed to self-govern. So you had Muslims having their own institutions, having their own courts, you have Orthodox, you have Catholics. It's only in situations where they interact with Muslims or with the official courts that they would actually interact with the official Ottoman state. So this in turn, I argue, leads to coordination costs and leads to different types of group alignments. So what do I mean by coordination costs? High local heterogeneity makes it hard for people to collaborate with one another. So if we think about education in particular, there might be disagreements, for example, with the literacy script, whether they should be using Cyrillic, Latin, or Arabic, or also female school attendance. It's fascinating to read about the attitudes of Bosnian Muslims, and many farmers were very much against sending their daughters to school because they felt that their culture is being erased. So this wasn't necessarily about female literacy per se, but rather a perception that their culture is being erased. Group alignment has to do with resistance to state institutions. So this really applies to the Muslim minority in the former Yugoslavia. So Muslims used to be majority under the Ottoman Empire. After the fall of the Ottoman Empire, they become a minority. So they have all of a sudden the Kingdom of Yugoslavia and the communist Yugoslavia that has either an Orthodox state or Orthodox government, or maybe a secular state. So they didn't feel that they're being represented. So this is what I mean when I refer to the term misalignment. There's a misalignment between specific groups in society and the central state. So this, I argue, also affects literacy outcomes, but affects it in a negative way. So under these kinds of situations, when you have variation in ethno-religious diversity, these are situations in which you're going to see lower literacy, and you're going to see situations in which legacies persist. Okay, so in terms of contributions to the literature, I think I speak to a few strands of literature. So the first one is about the impact of administrative capacity on public goods outcomes. There's actually extensive literature both in economics and political science explaining that the Habsburgs had a professionalized bureaucracy all the way to 1700s under Maria Theresa. They even had mass literacy after the second half of the 18th century, again under Maria Theresa. So durable Habsburg rule is connected to better bureaucracy, better record keeping. This is in contrast to the Ottoman Empire. We also have extensive literature about the connection between diversity and coordination and monitoring costs. So the more canonical literature, thinking about Adesina, thinking about Wimmer, would suggest that diversity, ethno-religious diversity, ethno-linguistic diversity is usually bad for economic outcomes, mostly because of coordination costs. And then we also have more recent literature explaining why authoritarian regimes fight for mass literacy. So if we're talking about Europe, it seems to be the case that much of the population became literate under authoritarian regimes, not under democratic regimes. And this is because there was a push to build nations and to inculcate people with ideological values. So if we think about communism, the main purpose of getting people to read and write was to actually get support for the communist government. And in doing so, they were able to get people to read and write. What is missing, however, from this literature is an understanding about when do legacies persist and when do they fade. So we have extensive literature on the legacies of colonialism, the fact that imperial weak administrative capacity reproduces itself over time, and you continue to see deleterious access to public goods in the long run. We also have, as I mentioned, some literature on authoritarian regimes, the fact that they are better able to reduce historical inequalities. But we do not have a good understanding about the context in which some of these attempts are successful and when they're not. So this is where I'm trying to make a contribution. So fundamentally, I'm trying to specify how social structure interacts with state alignment in order to condition the ability of states to overcome weak state capacity, historical weak state capacity. Okay. Moving on to methodology. So I'm using a novel methodology in this paper that kind of exonerates geographic regressions continuity design. So within political science, but also economics, there's been this methodology where people have been using historical borders in order to evaluate the causal effects of historical institutions. In the past 5 years, or maybe even 10, I guess, there's been a lot of pushback against this kind of methodology, suggesting that the as-if random assumption, an important assumption behind this methodology, cannot be easily defensible. Essentially, the assumption behind this methodology is that borders are randomly drawn, but we all know that borders are almost never random, right? So this novel methodology allows us to identify specific sections of the border that meet this as-if random assumption. So rather than saying the whole border was random, I'm actually identifying sections of the border after analyzing primary sources carefully that kind of likely meet this as-if random assumption. So this is how this methodology works. These are again these two political entities. This is literacy in 1930. This is the border between the Habsburg and the Ottoman Empire. This methodology consists of extracting points on this border. Specifically here, I extracted 164 points, but for representation purposes, for visual purposes, I just present here 52. So this novel methodology allows us to identify local treatment effects along the border. So this type of methodology, together with ideographic research, I'm going to explain in a second what I mean by ideographic research, together with covariate balance, constitutes a really powerful causal tool to identify the long-term legacies of these two empires. So, ideographic research is the terminology that was proposed by Kosher and Monteiro in an influential piece from 2015, Perspectives on Politics, who were one of the first people to critique the use of GRT more emphatically. They said that it's very hard to prove the randomness of borders, but that's why it's important for researchers to perform really in-depth historical research, to go to the archives and to kind of look at what were the motivations behind policymakers to draw the border in that particular fashion. And they also provide a framework for how to do this. They say that researchers need to answer three important questions. One, what is the knowledge that policymakers had when they drew the border? What was the incentives to draw the border in that way? And was there any space for maneuvering the drawing of the border? So I looked at the primary and some of the secondary sources about the Habsburg-Ottoman border. So in 1699, there were commissions of engineers that were delegated in order to study the geography of where the border between the Habsburg and the Ottoman Empire would be drawn. So they evaluated, analyzed very carefully rivers, marshes, forests, all the areas where this border could be drawn. When it comes to incentives, it was mostly the principle of uti possidetis, but also realpolitik that determined where the border would be drawn. So what does uti possidetis mean? This is the legal principle according to which the land that used to belong to the empire should continue to belong to the same political entity in the aftermath of a political treaty. But what is interesting here when we look at the primary sources is that there are specific sections of the border that seem to have mattered less. I call them low stakes segments. So these are parts of the border that coincide with two rivers that are called Una and the Sava. I'm going to show them to you in a few slides. And finally, there was some capacity to maneuver the border, but the policymakers were very much focused on enforceability and also the principle of stability. They didn't want to have another war over the border, and they didn't want to put in all the effort once again in order to come up with a new border configuration. Okay, so these are all the different parts of the border that I identified. Let me try to zoom out once again. These are all the different segments of the border that I was able to identify. So this is a land border here close to the Dalmatian coast. So this is the Adriatic Sea, and this is the other land section of the border in Romania. These are the two rivers that I mentioned earlier, the Una and the Sava. This is the Danube River. The most credible causal effects should be here on the Una and the Sava River. So these are, according to primary sources, low stakes segments. So they didn't care about geostrategic interests. I even have the quote suggesting that people are exactly the same on one side of the border versus the other, and there's no commercial or no sort of economic interest on the other part. So this means that these two segments are likely the most credible causal, the segments where we can get causal effects for the long-term legacies of these two empires. So this is how this methodology works. If you look carefully, you see these points starting to appear. So these points essentially are local treatment effects. You can estimate the causal effects of these two empires on literacy at all these different points. You see the border here in a straight line, so this is a coefficient plot, and you see the border as it was or as it is on the map. So all these different points represent causal estimates using counties exactly next to these border points. So for example, there's a negative 20% here at this point, there's then 15 percentage points next point, and so on and so forth. So you get the idea. You can estimate an effect alongside all these different points of the border. So the most credible ones are the ones here on the Sava and the Una River, so around 25 percentage points. What I do next, I identify the ones that are statistically significant, so I mark them with a triangle. And then I also do covariate balance. So covariate balance is essentially a statistical test that allows me to estimate whether geography is very similar on the two sides of the border. So this is what exactly these red square represents. There's only specific parts of the border where geography is balanced. So the concern here is that the reason why I'm seeing differences has nothing to do with institutions, but maybe there's more mountains on one side, or maybe the one area is less inhabited. And in certain cases it is true, but in these cases here and here, it's not. Okay, so this, as I alluded to in the introduction, female illiteracy is an even more strong result. So what I showed you earlier is really just population literacy. If we look at female illiteracy, and I'm focusing here just on Yugoslavia, you see about minus 58 percentage points lower literacy for women. So you can also see it on the map. So where you see darker gray, this means higher literacy. Where you see lighter gray and even white, that's illiteracy. So women are much more illiterate in 1931 in the former Yugoslavia, and you can also see this effect using different methodologies. Okay, moving on to mechanisms. So what I have shown you so far is really this connection: imperial legacies, literacy outcomes. Ottoman Empire is connected to higher illiteracy in 1930. Now, I'm going to show you how one of the inherited institutional legacies is state capacity. This is the same methodology showing you thinner local administration. So I calculated density of local bureaucrats per capita in 1931. This, according to these results, there's about -3 percentage points fewer bureaucrats on the Ottoman side in 1931. So this is one of the inherited legacies. Moving on to some time trends over time. So this is kind of a more complete picture compared to the slide that I started off with. I started off with showing you 1931 and 1991. This is showing you the data all the way from 1910 up to 1991 for Romania. So you see that the Ottoman side starts with a disadvantage of about 25%, and it reaches only a difference of about 1 percentage point in 1991, showing you that communism was highly successful in alleviating these regional inequalities. So, as you might imagine, the traditional way of building, getting people to read and write is really by building schools, training teachers, enforcing these policies, but they also had less traditional methods, such as what you see in this picture. One of the Communist Party cadres was going to the villages to read the newspaper to the villagers. The point was, on the one hand, to get propaganda, to get them to get farmers to support the party, but also in doing so, they were able to get some farmers to read and write. They also had evening schools where they were inviting people in the 40s or the 50s in order to acquire literacy skills. The picture looks like this in Yugoslavia. So you start off with a much greater inequality in literacy, so about 35-40 percentage points difference, and it only goes down to about 8 percentage points in 1991, so still a lingering difference. Okay, moving on to the second mechanism, how imperial legacies impacted ethno-religious diversity and how that impacted coordination costs and group alignment. So, what does this mean? So just to quickly remind you what I mean by low state alignment. This essentially means that there is a mismatch. There's a limited perception of legitimacy. Certain groups perceive the state as less legitimate. So this is the case of the Muslim minority in the former Yugoslavia. So this is, for example, the interaction effect that shows that the evolution of literacy among Muslim populations all the way to 1930 up to 1991. So there's a substantial, statistically significant difference when it comes to literacy for the Muslim community. So the Muslim community is much more literate compared to Orthodox and to Catholics. And you continue to see this lingering difference all the way to 1991. So part of the reason why you see these lingering differences in literacy really has to do with the fact that it's really the Muslim community that was more illiterate. Okay, some evidence for the misalignment. So one of the most convincing accounts, ethnographic accounts that I found is really this book by Bringa. It's a book called Being Muslim the Bosnian Way. And I found this really relevant and interesting quote that I think is reflective of misalignment. So here's what I found. To the teacher in state school, a Muslim was a member of a communist and non-religious group. To the mosque teacher, Muslim identity was primarily an Islamic one. Additionally, something else that Bringa is saying, villagers understood that an individual could not at the same time hold Communist Party membership and be a practicing Muslim. So there is something to be said about the tension between people's Muslim identity and the central state. So there's also accounts in this book suggesting that certain families didn't want to allow their daughters to go to school for too long because they felt that their culture is being erased. So what this tells us that there is something to be said about resistance. There's something to be said about people resisting state capacity building projects. And here's another interesting result that is illustrative of that. This is a quantitative result using public opinion surveys from 2010, 2016, and 2025. So this presents an interaction effect that examines trust in parliament. So I also have trust in the presidency. This is a very specific example suggesting trust in institutions. So what this graph shows you is that as people get older, so the distinction here is between Muslims and non-Muslims. The green line represents the effect for Muslims. The red line represents the effect for non-Muslims. So what is interesting in this graph is that as respondents, Muslim respondents get older, so older Muslim respondents trust institutions less. And this is different from non-Muslims. So I think this really tells us something about this misalignment mechanism. So people who were educated in the 60s and the 70s, they had a much harder time trusting the state. Okay, some recent results that I found. So I guess one question here, to what extent is this a supply side effect or supply side mechanism versus a demand side effect? So to what extent is it the case that maybe the state didn't build schools or didn't offer enough teachers? This is precisely what this graph shows. It shows density of schools. So it is indeed the case that I only have data for 2 years, for 61 and 1981, but what's interesting is that in 1961, it seems that the Muslim community has only slightly fewer schools than the rest of the country, but this effect was no longer visible in 1981. So you cannot make the case that there was lower educational infrastructure in the Muslim inhabited areas. So there's also probably it takes a few generations for people to take full advantage of the educational infrastructure, but there is this interesting discrepancy between the official educational infrastructure that's visible, that's there, versus when you look at educational outcomes. Okay, so in terms of coordination costs, there's limited effects. When I looked at ethno-religious fractionalization, there were no visible effects. The strongest and most convincing effect was really this misalignment effect for the Muslim community. So just some concluding thoughts. So I argued that imperial legacies persist unless states have the capacity to build infrastructure and when there is alignment between citizens and states. So I argue that it's not enough just to build capacity, meaning to build schools, to train teachers, but it's also important for citizens to be part of the state building project. So Romania had both state capacity and alignment, given that the Ottoman side was much more homogeneous. Yugoslavia had both limited state capacity and ethno-religious diversity, which complicated this picture. I also hopefully demonstrated the use of this novel methodology called GRD2D, which together with historical ideographic research can really give us causal estimates for the effects of historical states. And I think there are broader implications here when it comes to how, under what conditions legacies can be erased versus stay in place. And then this is obviously relevant for debates on colonial legacies, state building, but also inequality. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. So since we have only one mic, when you ask a question, please be as loud as you can. Especially given that we have this dentistry work out there.
Maybe I should actually sit
down.
down.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. So, who wants to go first? You want? Yes, please. You just identify yourself.
Hello, my name is Amalia. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. I'm a second-year Maya student. I wondered why was it important for you, in your personal opinion, to choose literacy rates as your measuring factor, other than something like health outcomes or something like that? Why was literacy rates important to this research?
Do you take more questions?
No, let's do one by one.
Okay, so it was literally a puzzle. Like I was mapping literacy throughout Europe, and I noticed this interesting discontinuity. Typically, you see differences when you move from one country to the next, but I was puzzled by the fact that you have these stark inequalities in literacy per population, and even stronger differences when it comes to women. And in my previous work, I looked at the legacies of the printing press, the delayed adoption of the printing press in the Ottoman Empire, how that impacted access to schools and literacy and capital accumulation. In this project, I kind of dropped the printing press element, which was, I know it was advertised, but I think that that would have triggered more questions than answers. So literally, I looked at the map of Europe and I was struck by the differences, the discontinuities within the same country. So I was like, oh, why do we see this? It's been 50 or 60 years after the independence from the Ottoman Empire. How come we still see this difference? So it's literally intellectual curiosity.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think it's absolutely interesting to also hear how methodologically right this project is and what a deep dive it obviously requires to even speak about, to some extent, correlation causality. My question thus becomes, given that I studied economics and I know that when you look at the statistics, especially in historical and primary sources of data, it becomes very thin sometimes to even get data points. How you went about the acquiring all of this data, where did your journey take you to, which kind of archives, and then building on that, where do you think, and thank you for pointing out like the different data points and when you, for example, only were able to collect 2 data points within 2 decades, but where do you think this is potentially the strongest, and where potentially is there little impact? And the other thing I was wondering is if there's something like a pickup effect of once the literacy rate has been higher to some extent, then the improvement of literacy rate gets stronger, given that there are more people who are literate who will take over the teaching aspect also, for example, in the private, and it doesn't need the institutionalization of it. If there's something like this observable in the data. I don't know if the second part was well phrased. Do you?
No worries.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the question. So, as you can tell, maybe this was presented way too quickly, but these are all different censuses. Like this is 1931, 1961, 1981, 1991. There was, for 1991, there was also some data imputation going on, because there was not all the countries that were part of the former Yugoslavia had female literacy available. I went to the archives. I started off my journey during my PhD at Chicago. I went to the basement. I found this census from 1931. I took my phone. I scanned all the different pages. I used ScanTailor in those days. There was no ChatGPT or anything like this. ScanTailor still exists. It's like this tool that kind of cleans the image before you even do OCR, before you even do optical character recognition. So I was cleaning the pages, despeckling the pages, dewarping the pages, essentially making sure that the curvature is corrected, and then I put it into, I was using Abbey Reader, so that was it's a commercial software that kind of almost gets you an Excel spreadsheet from a historical book, but not always. Still, there was a lot of fixing that needed to be done. Then I had many of these censuses have these maps at the beginning that tell you exactly what county corresponds to what data point. Then I manually drew all the different polygons to make the map that you saw there. That was just where I spent like 2 seconds presenting, but that took weeks. So there's a lot of work. I think now we live in a time where these things could be done in an easier way. But all these different data points are the result of laborious efforts in the library, in the archives, of just filling my phone memory with pictures and with all these different things. And so your second point. So the interesting part here is like how the convergence part. The Habsburg side has always been more literate. So in the 1930s was like around 70 or 80% literate. It continued to advance, but the interesting part is how in Romania you upgrade from 30% all the way to like 70%. So you kind of see this different slope that I found interesting. So to answer your question, yes, you start high, you're going to continue to go up, but the interesting part is the slope, how quickly you move from low to higher level of literacy, which I found interesting, and why I decided to embark on this project.
So Hartmut and then
Yeah, one question about migration and people moving for 70 years, and how sort of data on individuals, socioeconomic profiles, and so on add to the overall picture.
So I looked at migration for Yugoslavia. I have it in the appendix. I think I have like about 5 pages dealing exactly with this problem. And essentially what I did, I identified the parts of Yugoslavia in the 60s, but also in the late 80s, where you see the biggest difference, like the biggest change in population. I eliminated those districts from the analysis, and overall the results still hold. But the important question here would be, in what way would the results change? So I guess you'd be tempted to think that in places where you see low literacy, you should also see more migration. People who have low literacy have higher stakes in leaving, right? Or they have more to gain from leaving. So this means
Or there's an obstacle. They can't leave.
Right.
Because they don't have opportunities elsewhere, so it could be both sides of the argument.
So I wonder, so if they don't leave, this means that we should see a reduced effect or an exacerbated effect. I guess that's what I'm trying to think about. So I'm tempted to think that, yeah, if they stay there, you should see a reduced, so you should see less of an effect. What I can tell you, I dealt with this problem. So I eliminated from the analysis the regions where you see the biggest shifts, and the results do not seem to change substantively.
So could you jump on that? I mean, that might probably impact your Romanian results more, and my understanding is that the Romanian community was much more present than the Yugoslav one, but you know, knowing the Soviet system, for instance, peasants simply couldn't move. You know, they did not have their internal passports until they were late, so they would benefit from all the schooling, but still stay there, even if they wanted to move to the cities. And that's why, you know, the literacy rate would bump up, while in later years they would get all the schooling and then go to the cities, which I assume would be, you know, more similar to the Yugoslav cities.
So I did two things about this. One was to look at surveys, public opinion surveys that report, where people report whether their parents, whether their relatives, their grandparents have been regressed in both Romania and Yugoslavia. I didn't find any difference in Romania between the two sides. And then I also did an analysis just focused on Serbia, right? So the southern part of Serbia is much more homogeneous. It's mostly Orthodox people. So what is interesting is that if you just focus, if you concentrate your analysis just on Serbia, you see convergence in 1991. So this kind of gives me more belief that my alignment mechanism works in societies where. In regions that are ethno-religiously homogeneous, it's much easier for the state to build literacy. So that's exactly what I find with Serbia. So this is how I thought about the repression problem.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm curious to know if it is possible, whether during the communist period there was a difference between Romania and Yugoslavia, or parts of Yugoslavia, in terms of people remaining Muslims, no? Because it is well known in economic history that all the Muslim countries were much less literate than the European countries, particularly Christian ones, you know, particularly Protestant ones. This is very well known in history. And therefore, if Romania has a lower percentage of people remaining Muslims than parts of Yugoslavia, maybe this is relevant.
So it's true, Romania has and had more in the 1930s, had some Muslims in the Dobruja area, so the area close to the sea. I think the maximum amount of Muslims I had for Romania was about 6%, and it seemed like they were more illiterate as well in Romania too.
Yeah, yes, because they were under the empire, under the Ottoman Empire. But
right.
Coming out of the Ottoman Empire, if there were not Muslims,
but
immediately they converged.
Right, but the interesting part, if you look at Turkey, I mean, there's a different story there about change of alphabet, about Turkic reforms and everything. Turkey becomes literate over time. The interesting part here is like the difference between these different religious groups, like why Orthodox pick up immediately but Muslims do not, and what explains the fact that Muslims, despite having the same number of schools, right, how come you see this delay in literacy?
Turkey was on the process of, so to speak, Europeanization.
Right.
No, so one of the first indicators is to spread literacy.
Right.
So maybe, but probably not the same as in the communist countries. In spite of the fact that the communists tried, in fact, to homogenize and discontinue the tradition, but they were more successful in Romania because very few Muslims remained in the place.
I would say it's because of much more the homogeneous ethno-religious makeup of the Ottoman side. Like it was mostly Orthodox, a few different minorities in Dobruja, but it was very low compared to the Orthodox majority. As I mentioned, the maximum number of Muslims I could find in a county in 1930 in Romania was about 6%. So it seemed like they had lower literacy, but I think what's a key explanation here is really ethnic or ethno-religious homogeneity. In places that are more ethno-religiously homogeneous, it's much easier for states to build literacy.
Yeah.
In places that are more diverse, they fight back or they're more resistant. They're not immediately accepting of the state project.
I'm not entirely convinced, at least, but in any case.
So I will jump in.
Okay.
So first of all, why are we talking about imperial legacies at all? To me, it sounds more a story about Romania and Yugoslavia rather than a story about the Ottoman Empire and what those states do and cannot do.
Okay.
A second question is, so since you mentioned southern Serbia, do similar results hold for, say, Kosovo when Kosovo was part of Serbia, or, for instance, or I would, really interested, to see difference in Bulgaria between the Orthodox and the Turks until they got expelled in 1989. Those were both parts of the Ottoman Empire. So if we would see some differences, I would probably be more inclined, to believe that it's an Ottoman story, at least at the very beginning, rather than a Bulgarian or a Romanian or Yugoslav story. In other words, where do exactly do? As much as I love legacies, and I do, where exactly the Ottomans here, after so many years?
So why the Ottomans continue to have an effect?
Yeah, like why are we talking about, the Ottoman legacy rather than, the failure or the success of Romanian or the Yugoslav states?
I mean, I think I'm telling a story of both, right? So the starting point is like these two countries that have been under the same empires, Habsburg and the Ottoman, the clear discontinuity here exactly at the border that it doesn't feel like it's random, or like to what extent that's exactly, where was it? Where you clearly see, even without marking any border, you clearly see a discontinuity in literacy. It feels that it's connected to empires, right? Or what would your answer be to that discussion?
So my answer would be that since we are talking about, decay of legacies, well, at some point, maybe, yes, it was a starting point, but, the analytical heavy lifting or the administrative heavy lifting is more on what Romanians and the Yugoslavs do, rather than, blaming it all on the Ottomans and bringing us back to the starting point. After so many years, at some point, maybe it's about Romanians.
I would say, that's what this paper is all about, right? Understanding, okay, this is time zero. This is what these countries were very similar in 1931, but how come one was able to overcome these differences, the other one wasn't? So it's precisely looking at the process, looking at what one state did, what the other one didn't, and what were the kind of background conditions that prevented one state from building literacy and the other ones did not. So I feel like I'm doing exactly that. I'm answering exactly that question in this whole project. This is time zero, and this is how these states deal with these differences.
Oh, and by the way, have you found differences in, not just in literacy, but say, for Ottoman and Habsburg, there was like cottage industry looking at corruption rates in the 1990s. Does it work there as well, for instance?
So there is, the work by Sasha Becker and co-authors looking at the legacies of the Habsburg Empire. They find that the Habsburgs trust institutions more, But obviously this is an endogenous process, right? I mean, trust is very much connected to access to public goods. So I did show you results for trust in the presidency and trust in...
Right, but no, more like behavioral corruption. So looking at Ukraine, where part was Habsburg, part was Ottoman, Romania, part Habsburg, part Ottoman, so do Habsburgs less corrupt? In what you see, in those areas, you know, within states.
So I haven't looked at that specific. I have another project where in my first paper I looked at the issues of trust as it connects to the division dividing line, but there is research already. Becker, Juratska, I think they also look at the Habsburg Empire, they look at Ukraine, like Galicia and all these. Beisaking is another guy who's looking at issues of trust. So there is already research out there suggesting that the Habsburgs, descendants of the Habsburg Empire, trust institutions more, they trust each other more, whereas the Ottomans do not as much. So there is, but in this research I'm focusing on why in one region you overcome these differences and then in another one you don't.
In the back, yes.
I know at the beginning you kind of touched on this, but just the idea of direct and indirect rule, is that something that you utilize to determine those differences in terms of outcome literacy?
So that's I would say the starting point here. Like one of the legacies in terms of state capacity is exactly this, indirect rule by local notables. So the Ottoman Empire was actually one of the was a very strong state in Europe in the 1550s under Suleiman the Great. But a lot of historians talk about the Ottoman decline thesis. So after the 1500s, they started to sell offices. They continued this practice of tax farming, where soldiers, instead of getting money for their services, they would actually get villages to extract taxes from. So this kind of practice continued until 1700s. And in the second half of the 18th century, they started actually selling positions. In the same way you see Spain selling positions in Peru, in Latin America. So you have these governorships being sold for 7 years, and you had the same sort of practice happening in the Ottoman Empire until its very end, until around 1920s. So I argued that this is something that contributed to low bureaucratic penetration in the periphery, a low professionalization of the bureaucracies, which is very different from the Habsburg side, where you have civil exams taking place under Maria Theresa, where you have mass literacy being initiated. So you already start with a huge discrepancy that's visible in 1930s. Low bureaucratic apparatus on the Ottoman side and much higher bureaucracy on the Habsburg side.
So just to follow up, and I'm not sure if I'm answering this question right, but I mean, if I'm asking this question right, how about just the idea of, you know, once decolonization happened, let's say, what about the idea of like the local people, the society adopting to these institutions that were already there, and how effective they were in adopting these institutions, and how the effectiveness of adopting those institutions was also play a role in kind of determining how successful, let's say, you would see literacy rate or how literacy rates are undermined.
I mean, kind of that's what I'm trying to say in this project, right? To what extent some citizens accept a state-building project without too much questioning, whereas others feel like they don't feel the same way, or they feel like it's somehow misaligned, somehow in tension with their own identity. So I think that's exactly what I'm trying to do in this project. Why certain citizens accept and why others do not take it so they don't accept the state-building project as easily.
Thank you, I think I understand.
This is more of a comment answering my original question, which was asking you about why literacy was important. I think I get it now, because in my case, in my lived experience and research, my family is Pakistani, and I feel like the same reasoning can be applied in terms of like why has Pakistan or India or so many countries across the global south today been resistant towards education and specifically sending Muslim girls to school, or actually like any global south girl to school. It's usually been a act of resistance, and so you're using literacy rates as measuring acts against colonial resistance of Western imperial rule, through which institutions try to use education to basically carry out a colonial mission in more modern eras throughout time. So I think that this is really important, not just in the countries you mentioned, but
Right.
actually across the whole of any like formerly colonized or global south country today, where we see the exact same thing happening as not against a gender discrimination, but more of a wider radical method to stand up against Western imperialism or any form of like colonial rule.
Absolutely. No, thank you for doing my work to emphasize why this project is
I get
relevant
it
and
now.
has wider ramifications. I mean, and I don't even think it's just about Muslim people. It's also
No.
about minorities in general. It's not just about the West or colonized versus colonizer. It's always it's still something to be said about minority groups feeling like their identity and their culture is being taken away from them. So there's multiple examples in Latin America. I have an example from, I have a short, that there's only like 9,000 words that you can write, so you have very limited space to discuss external validity. But I think this is not just about Muslims versus non-Muslims. This is in general about minorities and their relationship to the central state and the extent to which their interests are being represented or not.
And I think it's not even about gender, it's about how are all these identities used for state power.
Exactly. Thank you. You articulated my message very well. Thank you.
You're welcome. If you ever want any more help, I'd be happy to join your mission.
Ask for money, ask for money.
Yeah, why not? Let's talk.
I'd love to.
Yes, go.
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna touch, I can go back to her comment, but what about just the idea of like, not necessarily the people themselves rejecting the institutions, but the institutions rejecting the people, and how does that play into that, right? Because I think my region of like specialists, I would say, is more like on the continent of Africa. A lot of these nations, right? After decolonization, you had these elites that took over within these bureaucratic institutions that were formed externally, and now you see that you have the elites, and then you have like the rest of the population, and most of them don't necessarily have access to these institutions, even if they want to, and maybe that also plays a part of that barrier where it's like the institutions are rejecting them instead of the other way around.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if, for example, there was a certain degree of freedom, like for example, okay, we will allow teaching of Arabic characters, for example, or we would sort of try to collaborate with the local imam or with the local mektebs or the local Islamic schools, probably people would have felt less resistant. So I guess if there is a perception of some sort of attempt by the state to accommodate the culture, the traditions, to take into consideration local preferences, I think these kinds of mass literacy campaigns could be more successful or could be met with lower resistance. So it seems that, as I hopefully showed in the quotes, there wasn't much of that at all. It was just a blatant erasure. There was a clear contrast or tension between Islamic identity at an Islamic school versus Islamic identity in a regular secular school. So I think if there is a state attempts to accommodate local preferences, I think that these campaigns will be much more successful.
I also wondered, what type of education are you looking at here? I mean, in the case of Afghanistan, the neoliberal agendas push like Western types of education and don't validate other forms of education that are not classed as like, Western, but there's like so many countries in the global south that are teaching young people things that are not classed as education. See what I mean? Like whether it be farming and agriculture, that's still education. Whether it be Islamic knowledge, that's still education. So like in this case, what are we seeing education as and not as?
So here you'd see literally ability of people to read and write. Like most of these censuses recorded whether people could read or write. So essentially basic math skills and basic ability to read and write text. Obviously later on you have higher education. In Romania I looked a bit at like what is the percentage of people who have university degrees, what is the percentage of people who have secondary school and so on and so forth. But mostly in this project I focused on basic literacy. I didn't look beyond that.
In which language?
In the national language, so Romanian. These censuses record literally can you read or write.
Okay. So if you can read or write Quran in Arabic, that will be recorded or not?
It would be considered, if you cannot read Cyrillic or Latin, you'd be considered illiterate.
Okay. Okay.
So maybe it's an issue with our definitions of what's literacy and education throughout time.
Right. I mean, this is also goes to your question, like, well, how did they record it in 1931? It's literally, I have to look exactly at the definition of literacy, but not my sense of how they recorded it.
I'm very curious, so I know that you changed the topic of the presentation, but how exactly do Sultans and the printing press come into the story?
Okay, so let's get into it. So, I still have, I have like 200 pages I'm happy to share with you, and I have some really interesting chapters on why the printing press was adopted later in the Ottoman Empire. I have the first Fed month from 1770 under Ahmed III, and the reason why he allowed Ibrahim Tatarika to have the printing press. Anyway, long story short, there's also a very interesting map that I have that shows that there's many fewer printing presses on the Ottoman region all the way to 1800s. There's also this very interesting correlation between limited availability of the printing press on the Ottoman side and the Ottoman control regions. I argue that this impacted the accumulation of human capital in the long run. Of course, we're talking about 2 centuries or 3 centuries of data, but there's extensive both qualitative and quantitative work. Dittmar or Van Zanden are some of the economic historians that have looked at the relationship between printing press and human capital accumulation. I argue that the delay in the adoption of the printing press limited the ability of people to acquire literacy skills, to acquire economic skills, and I argue that this impacted long-term developmental outcomes as well. My results are not as well identified when I looked at the printing press, which is why I decided to focus just on these for this presentation. But I have about 100 pages of correlations and beautiful maps, and also some beautiful screenshots of the first Fed month in the 1770s. I'm happy to share them with you if you're interested.
Follow up on the theme, bringing communism back in. How communists are the communists in Romania, Yugoslavia over time, and are there Romanian Ceausescu type of levels of independence, notions of regional variation of communism within Yugoslavia? Does that play a part? And does the school system reflect those variations of intensity of communist centralization when you look at the data? And maybe it's too complicated. I'm already impressed how many factors you can factor in, and making it slightly more complicated, but you, I'm sure, have an answer.
Yeah, so I'm getting back to the question that Evgeny asked earlier. So I looked at perceptions about communist repression and torture. So the same data that I used for the surveys that show trust. There's also questions related to what extent do you feel that the communists were repressive against you, against your family, against your grandparents, against your relatives. So I didn't find any effect in either of the countries. So I know the location of the respondents. I didn't find any statistically significant effect either in Romania or in Yugoslavia, because I did receive this comment before, the fact that Ceausescu might have been more repressive. And just looking at these survey results, it doesn't seem to be the case. It seems that Ceausescu was repressive everywhere. It wasn't just specifically more repressive on the Ottoman side, right? And then I also looked at as I said, I restricted the analysis to Serbia, and it seems like when you have Serbia, the southern part is mostly Orthodox, it seems that you do see convergence.
And any final question? Well, if not, then please join me in thanking Bogdan
Thank you so much once again. It's been a pleasure to present here. Thank you so much for engaging with my work and for the really thoughtful questions. So if you have any comments, or if you'd like to know more about my other works, this is like how I made the borders, but you can find more of my work here on my website, and feel free to email me if you have questions or you'd like to talk to me more.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Anyway, as we look at life expectancy, well, I assume that, if you live natural life in the village and live longer without being educated.
And then, of course,
some industrial platforms that would affect.
After PhD.
That's right.
So I suspect, I mean, this is obviously a question that is a question more developed.
Yeah.
I just the overall message.
You're bringing one of the And here we take
They're still educated, but they
So your recommendation unfortunately is
Public
more.
policy.
more people
So we're comparing pears and apples.
rather than say in more industrialized places like expect, especially those kind of like especially. So basically they are young.
how many people?
To this school. That's why you
So just just an age diagnosis to see if there are any differences.
public policy.
From Italy to the rest of Europe, but no press and no books consulted, so the Islamic merchants are being quite good, okay, because the others had applied much better techniques. My students who have done around
Welcome back.
400 school econometrics, and then the end you were able to explain your correlations.
Okay, so I'm just looking to see if
find out when they acquire the book.
And she wrote it on kind of in India. Yeah, and how women's rights are used to justify entry into India, like safety grounds around that, and how women
skills before school have that
be used as like
And the reason why they sold
be
the
there for each state.
space
Why
position
does
to
this
private people
because I just wrote
was
about all of
because
this.
they could they had the time in income and not taxing
But first, we didn't
in
get it.
China.